So what I figured was something necessary to do is to discuss a recent Southern Baptist or report on the Southern Baptist Convention on the issue of sexual abuse, and more specifically, how sexual abuse has been handled by the Southern Baptist Convention. You may remember that last year, it got mentioned that at the annual meeting last year, the messengers there at the convention voted to establish an independent third-party investigation of the Southern Baptist Convention Executive Committee and on their handling of sexual abuse in Southern Baptist churches and reports of sexual abuse and all that. And then they had to have the report done by, time for this annual meeting, which is next week. And the findings, I don't think they, revealed much more than what had already been known. But there were some things that were discovered about kind of the internal stuff that went on that there's all sorts of, shockwaves being sent out. And there's certain areas in the secular media that are having a heyday, just loving pointing at the Southern Baptists and the problems that we have internally. So I thought, well, this is actually something that's potentially huge in Southern Baptist. And so we should probably talk about it. Because it's an issue in the world where we have sin, and we want to make sure that we as a church, as a denomination, are handling it correctly in a biblical manner. There are in the back a few copies, I wasn't sure anybody even really want one, of the actual official recommendations of the task force. What happened was they assembled a task force, which was made up of Southern Baptist pastors. And then that task force oversaw the outside investigation. And so the recommendations actually come from the task force, not officially from the report. But if you want to see, it's like 5 pages. It's back there. I'll summarize them here in a little bit. Before we get into, because this thing is almost 500 pages long. And there were so many recurring things. Remember, it's a third party, not member of the Southern Baptist. They don't necessarily share our ideals and values. And so there were certain wordings and certain things. I'm like, they're not approaching it from the same biblical viewpoint that we likely would. And so a few things I just want to lay down first, right? Because anytime you're going to do something, what's important, right? You got to have the foundation, got to have the right framing, or the whole thing's just going to fall apart. And so just to lay out some things here that will hopefully give us the right perspective as we look at what the report found. And so first off, a key biblical principle when it comes to issues of accusations and justice, and especially criminality and mistreatment and that sort of thing, is the presumption of innocence. That is not just an American judicial thing. We get that from the Bible. And over again, in all kinds of places, you find this idea. 2 examples, Old Testament, New Testament, in Deuteronomy 17:6, right? It says, whoever's deserving of death will be put to death on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. He shall not be put to death on the testimony of only 1 witness. 1 witness is not sufficient. Well, why not? Well, because he's presumed to be innocent. You got to actually show that he's guilty, and that's going to require a bigger standard. And so you get the same thing repeated. 1 Timothy 5:19 says, do not receive an accusation against an elder except from 2 or 3 witnesses. Same idea. A little bit higher bar, because we're going to assume that, they didn't do it. You actually have to prove something. And so a lot of times we'll hear about an allegation or an accusation, an alleged abuser, an alleged, that sort of thing, because it hasn't yet been proven. And as much as our hearts break for the likely even victim of something horrendous, until it's actually been shown the person's guilty, we presume innocence. That's a biblical principle. Another thing to consider is the kind of biblical idea that God has created different institutions with different spheres of jurisdiction and influence, authority in life. You have the government, right, which administers justice, right? We're told this in Romans 13 and other places where the government bears the sword for the administration of justice, for the punishing of the evil and the protection of the good. You have the family, which is for the rearing of the next generation, for training and discipling children in the way of the Lord. And you have the church, which is for spreading the gospel, making disciples and discipling one another. It's the community of believers. And each exercises its rightful authority in its own area, right? If your kid's misbehaving, I don't get to whoop them. I bring them to you because I don't have that authority. That's your authority. If, this is one of the reasons why we have the separation of church and state. The government doesn't get to tell the church what to do because that's not its area of authority. I, as a minister of the gospel, I don't get to go into, city council and tell them, here's what you have to do, because that's not my sphere of authority, right? So you have these different areas of authority in that aspect. And then you have the Southern Baptist Convention. The organization of the Southern Baptist Convention is very unique among what you call denominations. Technically, the Southern Baptist Convention is not a denomination. It's not a top-down kind of thing.
One thing that
did not mean to start that right away. Short video, it's like 2 minutes or so. This is Tom Askell. Full disclosure, he is, I hope he will be the next SBC president. All three guys that are running are great guys. Any of them will do a fine job. They're good, godly men. I think he seems to have a better grasp on the cultural things and battles and whatever's going on. But he had an interesting thing where he explains this, because a lot of people are they're seeing the report, which we'll get into in a minute, and they're seeing things and they go, we need to do something. And he's like, okay, slow down, because the organizational structure of the Southern Baptist Convention, does play into what can and can't be done. So he's going to break this down just a little bit.
One thing that Southern Baptist churches must always remind ourselves of is that as independent, autonomous churches, we have an ecclesiology that arises from the Scripture. We have fought hard to understand what the Bible calls a New Testament church to be. And today we stand on the shoulders of men and women who have understood the teaching of God's Word and have handed down that teaching to us throughout generations. We are distinctively Baptist people. And because of that, we simply cannot take every suggestion and every recommendation that fellow Christians and other organizations would make to us. We are not per se a denomination in that we have a top-down authority structure. Rather, as is commonly said, headquarters in the SBC is the local church. In order for us to navigate the challenging world in which we live today, in order for us to care well for our members and to address concerns that arise within our association of churches, we must not forsake our biblical ecclesiology. We must be convictional, distinctively Baptist people. That is, we must maintain the autonomy and the independence of every church, recognize it, respect it, as we voluntarily cooperate together for common cause, for the work of evangelism and missions, for the work of disaster relief, for other benevolent enterprises. Praise God for all the good things that He's enabled us to do together. So as we address problems, as we address questions, as we look at the structures that we have organized to cooperate together to get the mission done, we must never forget that we are Baptist people. And so as Baptists, we must maintain our evangelical commitments. The gospel alone saves. We must maintain our biblical orthodoxy, that we say with all Christians everywhere what always God's people have believed in order to be saved. We are confessional people. That is, we have the Baptist faith and message that recognizes the supreme authority of God's word and its sufficiency for all that He's called us to be and do. So yes, let's address the problems that are around us. Yes, let's engage the culture as is necessary for us to maintain our commitment to Christ Jesus as Lord over every aspect of creation. But as we do it, Let's do it as Baptist people, as Baptists who are firmly committed to our biblical ecclesiology.
Bad editing. So just a little reminder there of that the Baptists are unique in our structure. And I'm going to try to get through this quick because it's taking a little bit longer than I anticipated. We have another meeting to get to. And I know you probably can't see that. The organizational structure of the Southern Baptist Convention is such that, as he said, the headquarters of the Southern Baptist Convention is the local church. It's a bottom up. What happens is you have your local churches, they're all autonomous and they function however they function. Typically, pastor, deacons, kind of structure. But then the churches will send messengers, and this year it's in Anaheim next week, to the convention, to the annual meeting. And technically, the Southern Baptist Convention only exists for 2 days. And then the other 363 days of the year, there are certain entities that are doing the business of what the convention decided to do. And those are voted on next week. We'll be voting on several different officers for the convention, president, vice president, treasurer, all that kind of stuff. Not everyone's up for re-election. There are certain other officers and things that will get decided on. Motions will be made. But they all are answerable to the messengers. The Southern Baptist Convention is literally just that gathering of, I think estimations are put in about 10,000 this year. Last year was 14,000 people. And within that, all the things that they do, there's all these different other entities. There's all the seminaries. There's, I think, 6 or 7 Southern Baptist seminaries, which even though Southern Baptists make up, I think it's like 11% of Christians in North America, Southern Baptist seminaries train 1/3 of the pastors in North America. And so that's a pretty big impact. But each seminary is its own individual entity, with none having authority over the others. You have a handful of committees and other entities within the Southern Baptists, like the Executive Committee, which is the focus of this report. You have the International Mission Board. You have the local mission board. I just totally went blank, can't remember the name of it. But none of these entities can tell each other what to do. They're all autonomous among themselves. And the Executive Committee, while it does have, its headquarters in Nashville and it kind of sees the day-to-day functions of a lot of stuff, it doesn't have authority over any of these other entities either, nor does it have authority over the local church. So the Executive Committee is, kind of the big focus of this. Members focus on, the messengers will elect the president. That's one of the big things that'll get done next week. And the Executive Committee is the focus of the report. And you have all of these other entities, as I said, they all answer back to the messengers. If you want to look at what is the hierarchical structure, whether you're talking about Lifeway or Baptist Press or the Executive Committee or the International Mission Board or one of the seminaries, they all answer to the convention, the messengers. There is no governing body that's telling everybody what to do. The governing body that tells everybody what to do are the messengers that get sent to the convention. Okay. So on that idea, right? So the messengers are decided, and the messengers answer to the local church. Right? So what James and I are going to be doing next week is representing y'all and what, hopefully represents this church and what we vote for and the motions we, approve or disapprove, that sort of thing. So if you have, for instance, one of the things, and we'll get into this, that the Executive Committee cannot tell a local church what to do. It doesn't have that authority. And that's one of the things that comes up in the report is, well, yeah, we'll get into it. Okay. So here's the findings of the report. They looked at from 2000 to 2021, and how the executive committee, because it was specifically about the executive committee, had been handling sex abuse reports. They say the executive committee has mishandled reports of sexual abuse that exists in Southern Baptist churches. There has been a strict control of information. There's been hostility expressed towards survivors and advocates, that the Baptist press has actually altered articles on sexual abuse in a way that has caused harm. And there has been resistance by the executive committee to reforms to help fix these issues. And so just to look at some close, as I said, this is almost like a 400 to 500 page report. So I picked some little examples that really kind of represent. The mishandling, this is the things that they talk about when they're saying that they mishandled reports. The executive committee's response to sexual abuse, and this is quoting from the report, the executive committee's response to sexual abuse allegations was largely driven by senior executive committee staff members, particularly D. Augie Boteau, the executive committee general counsel and later interim president, as well as the SBC's long-serving outside counsel, James Gunther, James Jordan, and the firm of Gunther, Jordan, and Price. Now, I don't know if you noticed something about all those people that got mentioned, because it kind of makes you understand the other finding on this issue they have, where, and this was a big complaint you see all through the report, that their main concern was avoiding potential liability for the Southern Baptist Convention. As this report documents, those who reported abuse were often ignored or told that the SBC had no power to take action. Mr. Gunther advised the EC staff should not undertake to elicit further information or details about reports of abuse so that the executive committee not assume a legal duty to take further action. And so what you have is all of the, for whatever reason, anything having to do with sexual abuse is getting funneled to these guys, which kind of makes sense because they're all lawyers. And so if you're on staff and you got something about sexual abuse in a church, that's a legal issue. So what do you do with it? You throw it to the lawyers. What do lawyers do? Right? They don't want to assume any liability. Their job as a lawyer, I mean, just their whole mindset. It's the lawyer mindset is, my client, the person I'm representing, I'm arguing for, looking out for their best legal interests. Now, some of the ways this was handled, and again, I can't get into it all because it's a big report, I think probably could have been handled better. Some of the ways that it was done where it became obvious that it wasn't just a, sorry, we can't help with that, but it was an actual, go away, kind of a, shush, don't do that sort of thing going on. And it wasn't always handled well, even though I can understand why it was done the way it was done. Because as soon as the executive committee gets involved, now they've taken on potential legal liability, which I don't think it was even less than a day after this report dropped, started seeing ads for lawsuits. Have you been abused in a church in Southern Baptist? Contact the law office of blah, 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 blah. Start seeing those ads popping up as soon as this report came out. And that's the kind of thing that they were trying to avoid. Now, understandably, we are Christian people. We're about the gospel. We're about Jesus. Love the Lord. Love your neighbor. We want to love people, care for people, mourn with those who mourn, care for the oppressed and the afflicted. And so it does grate on us whenever it is just, they were more concerned about the legal aspect than they were about the hurt of the victims. I understand both sides. So the legal issue was a real issue. But I don't think it was always handled well, particularly when it comes to the idea of the control of information. Because these are things being reported to the executive committee, but the executive committee was not getting the information. Again, quoting from the report, it says, over the years, the existence of these reports of abuse were not shared with the executive committee trustees, the members of the committee. executive committee trustees generally are not privy to the day-to-day decision-making by the executive committee staff and officers, which would make sense because these people have jobs. They're oftentimes pastors, professors, other positions in different entities and whatnot. They only meet, I think, 3 or 4 times a year. So they have staff that sees to the daily, running of stuff. But it says, during the investigation time period, those decisions were largely left to the discretion of the executive committee president, CEO, and his closest advisors on staff, with high-level issues brought to the SBC president. There was no apparent effort to inform the trustees or involve them in the decision-making process regarding the issue or the existence of sexual abuse in the Southern Baptist Convention. Which, if you're part of a committee and someone reports to that committee something and you just never know. There were, in interviews they had with present and past committee members, they would ask questions about reports of abuse and they're like, I never heard that. It never came up. There were lawsuits where people had sued the executive committee, and you had members of the executive committee that had no clue because it was all compartmentalized and handled by this group of 3 or 4 guys who were attorneys, and they took care of it, brushed it on the rug. That is not correct. That did not need to be handled that way. I think that it should have been known to the entire committee. If any time there's questions or anything, just let me know. Shout it out. Raise a hand, whatever. Yes. Forget how long trustees serve for. I think it's 4 years. So some of those trustees are still trustees. I will say the biggest name that kept popping up over and over and over again was that Augie Boteau. He resigned back in 2019, I think it was. And in the last 3 or 4 years, the convention has been making more of a shift to being open and discussing these issues rather than just handing it off to the lawyers who stick it in a drawer and don't talk about it. So there was hostility expressed towards I throw in the word certain survivors or advocates. The reason I do that is because there are 2 specific examples that tend to be where all the hostility centers around, and it was rather adversarial. Anyway, there was Krista Brown. She had been abused, and she was outspoken and wanting to get change, and she was involved with and represented by a group called SNAP, the Survivors Network of Those Abused by Priests is the name of the organization, and that's their thing. They advocate for people who had been abused by clergy. Where it turned hostile, if you read in the report, there's a letter that the SBC received from SNAP, and it was packed full of passive-aggressive comments and backhanded compliments, and it was rather aggressive and hostile and accusatory. And at that point, the lawyer said, we're not talking anymore. We had hoped that we could come to some understanding and help the issue, but your tone, we're not dealing with you. And that's when the hostility developed there. So not saying it was great on their part to do, but it was coming from both sides. The other example of hostility outright that it gives is a lady by the name of Jennifer Lyle. We'll get into her story in just a minute, but it did turn a little adversarial, and so that's where some of that hostility came from. Again, mishandled, and it turned ugly. And one of the things, and this was this on the hostility part, because these others were, I think, legitimately adversarial situations where both parties were given as good as they were getting. However, they have records of emails and testimony of private conversations that were rather negative and derogatory, which, okay, you're not talking to the, survivor that way, but what does it say about your heart that that's the way you're thinking about them? And so that doesn't reflect good. So there was that as well. I think one of the ugliest examples is what came with Jennifer Lyle and the Baptist Press article. So she had been a longtime employee with Lifeway. And this is just the biggest example. There were some other things where the Baptist Press changed things and edited things, and the way they reported on some stuff. So she had been abused by a seminary professor, and I could not remember his name and ran out of time to look it up. She had talked to several people who were in different positions, her employee or her employer, and other people at Lifeway, other people at the seminary, including Albert Mohler, who some of y'all might be aware of. And she was encouraged to share her story because, hey, this guy's still a professor and he's out there, and so you need to share your story. So she talked to the Baptist Press. The Baptist Press agreed. A few days before the story was to go to print, the lawyers got involved. And they said, we don't like the use of the word abuse because that might create liability for the Southern Baptist Convention. And so the rewording of the article made it sound like it was a consensual relationship, not abuse. And then she basically got her life ruined because now she had been cast in the public eye as an adulteress, as as her being the sexually immoral one whenever she was the victim. And it took months. I think the story was published in March of the year that it happened, or that it got published, and it took till like October until the Baptist Press finally issued a retraction. And as that time went on, this is where some of the hostility got. Understandably, she got more and more hostile. Eventually, some legal action came in there, and she ended up suing. And but then they got hostile back. And that was, big ugly business. But her life was ruined. There's still people, despite the retraction, how retractions go. Whenever the newspaper corrects something, story's already out there. And so. And the crazy thing was she had, it's not like she was, struggling under horrible depression and trauma and conflicted. She had gotten on with her life, but just felt, I need to report this because he's still out there. And then this ended up happening. And it's one of those things where you could try to claim, well, we didn't mean that. Well, but that's still what you did because you changed it. And looking out for your own best interests ended up ruining somebody's life. So there was that. Those are some of the biggest highlights, I think, of the findings of the report. There were some other instances that, even though even the ones I found kind of credible, really kind of come down to he said, she said, because it's stuff being reported, 10 years after the fact, and people denying this or that happened and no corroboration kind of stuff. One of the other accusations is that they were resistant to any kind of reforms. People would say, hey, here's some things y'all can do to help victims of abuse in Southern Baptist churches. And they would bring, things to them, and they were hesitant, they were resistant much of the time to any kind of reforms or any kind of change. Oftentimes it says calls for something to be done were usually met with appeals to the structure of the SBC and the autonomy of the local churches, which is not necessarily a dodge. It might be a convenient shield that someone's really willing to just throw out there as an excuse to just not have to deal with it. And if that's the case, that's bad. Don't need to do that. However, as we discussed before, the structure of the Southern Baptist Convention, if someone comes to the executive committee and says, you have a pastor in that church over there who, is guilty of sexual abuse, they can't do anything about it. They don't have any authority to do any kind of anything to that church. The Southern Baptist Convention does not ordain pastors. I'm not here as your pastor because someone, in an office in Nashville said, here's your new pastor. I'm your pastor because y'all chose that I would be your pastor. And so the Southern Baptist Convention, the executive committee, does not have any authority over, any kind of disciplinary or, removal power or anything over what goes on inside of a local church. That autonomy of the local church is a central core Baptist thing. And so being resistant to reform, if that proposed reform requires violating, that structure, well, that's not an excuse. That's just literally, we can't do anything about that. Which kind of makes, like, why report these things to a body that can't actually do anything about it? Report it to someone who can. But, however, some things that were done. They did implement a few reforms in the last few years. And I believe it's 2019, they created what's called a credentials committee, which isn't specifically about sexual abuse. It's about whether they determine whether or not a church is in friendly cooperation, is the term. If a church is actually operating in line with the Baptist faith and message and the views of Southern Baptists. And then if someone reports, hey, this church is, not operating, they're teaching things against the Baptist faith and message, or, that Southern Baptists don't, allow women pastors. And so if they say, hey, they got a woman pastor, or, hey, the pastor over here had an affair, or, hey, this sexual abuse thing happened, then the credentials committee would look into that and say, okay, yes, that church is not in good standing with the Southern Baptist Convention. But even then, they make a recommendation to the convention, and the messengers at the convention will say, we agree. And they're out of, and then all they can do is expel them from the Southern Baptist Convention and say, okay, you're out of the club. That still doesn't actually do anything, to the person who's doing the abuse. They don't have any authority over them. But they can say, you're not welcome in the Southern Baptist Convention if you're allowing this to go on in your church. We're kicking you out. That's about all they can do with the Credentials Committee, which created a lot of problems because people were expecting some kind of, I think the actual term was that advocates and victims were expecting justice. Like, we're the church. The church isn't the body that has authority over justice. That's the government. But the other thing that they did is they started what's called the Caring Well Conference, which is about sexual abuse awareness in churches and that sort of thing, which I don't actually know too much about that conference, but that's one thing that has been happening. All right. Any questions about any of that before we get into the recommendations? So what ended up happening is the people who did the report said, hey, here's where we saw some weaknesses. Here's some things y'all can do to stop this from happening in your churches. But they don't actually have any authority to make the recommendations. So the task force, which is actually made up of Southern Baptist pastors, they issued recommendations that will be considered at the convention next week. And so, but any questions, comments, or about anything else we've covered so far? See, and that's one of the things is, yeah, and it's one of those things that has bothered me just in general in society whenever they'll say, oh, well, we reported it to the school. Why are you reporting it to the school? The teacher did something. Well, call the cops. Don't call the principal. Again, the Sunday school teacher did something inappropriate, so we're going to go tell the pastor. Well, okay, tell the pastor, but call the cops. That's, I've never understood why there's so many. Yeah, right. On the individual. So, right. Unless there's cover up and, deflection going on, in which case they're now. Yeah. I mean, now I understand you got situations where it's like, well, it's a he said, she said, nothing's going to happen, nothing's going to come of it. And it would be bad for a church to be allowing somebody who, you know, yeah, yeah,
Yeah, but if the victim goes to the cops, they're trying to get, if they go to the church, it sounds like to me they're just trying to get money. So,
yeah, and it's
kind of blackmail.
well, that's one thing that I've always, you know, I get that there's this idea that there can be no justice for, because so often, you know, something gets reported and the police can't do anything about it because there's no evidence. It's he said, she said, right? That waited several days or whatever to go, and well, now, you know, there can't be a rape kit, and there's no, you know, I mean, and it's just like I said. Right.
And so that's why they want to tell pastors, pastor, stop.
Yeah. And so, which, you know, it brings an interesting situation to the church, because then it's like, well, we're not an investigative body. They don't have the skills or know-how. I mean, I can talk to somebody and what, you know. This is one thing, and I get into, I think, actually go into this a little bit in my notes in a second, but this is where church discipline comes in. I mean, it's about the only thing we could do, where it could be like, hey, you know, go to the person and say, there's this going on, and, you know, what she's saying you did is looking like you actually did it. And, you know, I mean, kick the guy out of the church is about all that you can do. Of course, one of the problems, one of the big complaints, and this is what comes up in the recommendations in a minute, is that, okay, fine. You know, the victim comes to the church believes her, it looks like he did it. You know, hey, you scumbucket, get out of here, right? She won't go to the cops, or there's no evidence anyway, so he's not going to get convicted or whatever. Well, we can kick him out of the church and he's gone and he can't hurt you no more. Well, now he just goes to another church 2 towns over and he's doing it again. Well, and that's one of the complaints is, you know,
The next question is, they come to the church and tell them, the church don't report it to the cops. Then they, you know, what's the problem?
well, and I believe Texas is a mandatory report state. I mean, if
I forget the list of professional people that are required to report to.
yeah, if someone came to me and said, hey, you know, Sunday school teacher touched me in a weird place, I got to report that. Yeah, nurses, teachers, all that kind of thing. And I think, yeah.
Not just those things, like whenever I was a youth minister in another church, a kid came to me and said that they were suicidal, right? Suicidal thoughts. I reported it. They were mad at me and they were pissed off and angry, but they went through counseling and they went through sessions. They're still alive. And they're still alive, of course. You know, but like, so even in moments like that, that's true. Whatever it is, if it's something substantial, yeah, you're going to report it if you're a good person.
Yeah.
If you care about them, you're going to.
Well, and biblically, especially something like that, where it's like, you know, it's not just a sin that's been committed, it's a crime that's been committed. We're not civil magistrate. That's got to go to the police, because that's not our sphere of jurisdiction. And so most of the recommendations that they have are things around education and increasing awareness and prevention training sort of programs, which that's great. The thing a couple weeks ago that for camp, where you got to get the little how to recognize abuse, you know, you see the signs and here's the way it happens and that kind of stuff. Those are great. I think it's wonderful for people to do those things, right? To have those things available for churches, and for the Southern Baptist Convention to do something to assist churches in, you know, increasing awareness and, you know, about abuse and that sort of thing. That's great. I love those recommendations, and that's something that can be considered. One of the weird ones was that there was a recommendation that Southern Baptist entities have a person on staff or an independently contracted person who's trained in abuse and trauma to receive reports and to provide guidance. So that's okay. I mean, I can see the benefits of having someone on staff who's, aware of and versed in, what needs to happen and someone who understands, okay, here's how you treat someone who's in trauma. You don't just, brush them off. So I kind of understand that a little bit.
So the problem there is to receive reports indicating we have the authority to receive and
Yeah.
take action. I think that's a wrong assumption.
Right. And I have a few concerns, and that's one of them. Let me go ahead and get the whole list out. One thing they want to do, and I don't have a problem with this one, create a 3-year task force to explore solutions, basically. It's like, hey, let's not rush into doing anything. Let's actually, the convention create a task force who actually starts to look into what are the best practices, what are the way to handle this, given our structure, given the situation, how do we need to do this? Rather than, freaking out because we see a report where all this horrible stuff has gone on. Well, we got to do something, and we just rush in and do the wrong thing. That sounds prudent to me. So, yeah.
Did you see the price tag attached to it?
Oh, yeah, but I don't remember. That was,
$3 million.
and the thing about that is, that money comes out of the cooperative program,
Yes.
which we give for the purpose of spreading the gospel, for missions and training and all that kind of stuff. So, okay. What?
After that $3 million,
Yeah. What's that?
after that $3 million was no guilty person
Yeah.
of the church covered.
Yeah. So my concerns, the use of independent firm. Well, first off, when it comes to having like someone on staff, well, okay, like you said, that's kind of creating a responsibility. That now here we are responsible for this. Has to do with us. We're taking this assumption of, whatever, and no, we need to be taking that on. But if you do an independent firm, some third party, now you're putting kind of the, forgot how I'd want to say it.
We did before with the lawyers.
Yeah, well, it's the idea you're turning power over the kind of the power of judging Christians is being turned over to some outside entity, which more than likely the entities that are going to be qualified and knowledgeable and certified and whatever to do that probably is going to be more secular. And so it's like, okay, so now we're letting someone else be the determining factor for something inside the church. That doesn't sit well with me. But again, as you said, we're assuming a role and a responsibility that don't know that we need to have. When it comes to, actually got these out of order. One of the things they have is they want a, these are really out of order. Oh, was that in the recommendations? Did I miss something? Oh, the last thing, the ministry check, the list of abusers. I was like, I'm missing something somewhere. Where'd it go? This recommendation is to create where the Southern Baptist has a kind of central like database of abusers. So church, clergy, staff, volunteers, anyone who's, been either convicted, confessed, had a civil suit, or is found to be credibly accused. Now, you had me with that first three. That fourth one is the one where I go, ooh, hold on a second. Now, when it comes to what they consider, what they define, and the report it defines credibly accused as being judged by the preponderance of evidence. This can't be just merely accused, but it has to be credibly accused. Obviously, it's not being found guilty in a court, but it's saying that investigation took place and it was decided that they're more likely than not that it occurred, is basically how that standard goes. And those all have legal definitions. It's not willy-nilly. What gets me there, though, is this is the exact same standard that's used in universities. So whenever you have, administration, someone comes forward and says, hey, I was at a party and so-and-so, assaulted me. Then the university has a panel that investigates, and, you get these Title IX kind of courts and whatever's going on. There's a lot of instances where, oops, come to find out later, they didn't actually do it. And so even though there seemed to be a preponderance of evidence and they thought it was more likely than not, come to find out it was false accusation, this person had their life ruined. There've been lawsuits that have been winning because of these things, because a university, kicked someone out, denied their scholarship, and it's like their whole, route they had planned in their life just falls apart because of this. And they turn around and sue and find out, lo and behold, oh, they were falsely accused. I don't know that, and usually that ends up happening after a rather lengthy and costly legal battle to get your name cleared. I don't know that I really like inviting that into the way the church does business.
So would they be suing the SBC or would they be suing the church?
Well, it would be the SBC. So like, say for instance, someone comes and says, hey, Pastor Mark did, blah, blah, blah. And they investigate and they go, well, preponderance of evidence, it seems more likely than not that you did it. And so, I'm out and I'm on the list and no church will hire me and I can't do anything. And I'm just having, whatever. And I'm out of ministry and all this kind of stuff going on. Well, okay, let's say I'm actually able to scrape together the money to hire a lawyer to fight this. Well, I would have to sue the SBC to clear my name, and so I don't think that's something that I would like to see invited into. No.
It also comes back to that judiciary. Said, investigation, finding out if someone's guilty or not, really doesn't seem like it should be.
Right. Yeah, and that's another thing. The church is not a civil magistrate. So determining someone's guilt of a crime, when it comes to church discipline, I think is about the only place that we can exercise that, where we're saying, hey, because we do have a different standard. There's a different standard of, someone could be found not guilty, but we all know he did it, right? OJ, anyone actually think OJ's innocent? Right? We all know OJ was guilty. Well, but he was let off by the jury. So he wasn't found guilty by court, but we all know, right? So it's like, okay, how do you balance that? Because you could have someone where it's like, well, we couldn't find him guilty, but we still don't want him as a pastor. We still don't want him, teaching Sunday school. We still don't want him, whatever, because we're pretty well convinced this and that. And so how do you juggle that? But that would be done through church discipline and actual, things internal at the local church. Getting the Southern Baptist Convention involved to where now they're making determinations about someone in a local church. That gets into that. They don't have the authority. So.
Is there a possibility that there, on the criteria could be that there has been an accusation? And that would be, that it would just stay on the list that some, Mark Langford accused but not convicted or whatever.
I don't know.
I'm thinking because in the financial world, it's you have to disclose any, we'll call it complaints, or they call them complaints on accusations, whether or not you were, found innocent or guilty, you still have to disclose it. So it's not an admission of guilt, you're wrong, but you know what I'm saying, that there was an accusation. Would that be maybe
I don't know. Could be.
instead of
That's still critical.
Yeah. Well, and the qualifications for a leader in the church is, beyond reproach. And so it can be the kind of thing where it's like, well, I mean, we don't think you did it, but, this fog over you and just the whole situation, you allowed yourself to be in that situation to where you got, maybe there was some impropriety, even though you didn't assault someone, or it was like, you're not above reproach anymore. So, yeah. But again, that'd be something for the local church to determine, not the national
That's what I'm saying.
convention.
You're on the list, but it's still the church who determines who they hire.
Right. The church can look and go, well, he's accused, but, and the church can determine, yeah, I mean, that might be something. Hopefully somebody wise can think of that. The issue of mandatory reporting. If people are, if I think that if the convention's response is anything other than, I'm sorry, there's nothing we can do about that. Here, let me direct you somewhere that can help. Because one of the things one of the lawyers said was, if someone is reporting abuse to you, stop, don't get information, because the more information you get, now we become liable because we've taken a report, we've gathered information, we don't, and so different states, I know, have different laws about mandatory reporting. But if someone calls into the Southern Baptist Convention, that's just a big legal spaghetti bowl of weirdness. I don't know why we need to insert ourselves as a convention into that.
That's the part about when it said they hire somebody to receive reports.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's somebody that will take liability on the SBC to receive reports. Well, maybe we shouldn't the cops should be receiving reports.
Well, and it could be a discussion within the SBC of them saying, do we actually, it's like, this is us assuming some liability. Do we want to assume the liability? I don't think the SBC should.
Because it goes back to that, now we're appropriating $3 million that should be going to missions.
Mm-hmm.
Which
Yeah.
they're in to do. That's what they're.
Yeah.
Whole entities for to do.
Right. It's creating, the Southern Baptist Convention doing something that isn't what it's there to do. Right. It's there to spread the gospel.
Not to miss something, but say somebody was accused and found innocent, do they now turn around and go after the accuser for lying?
See, yeah, I don't know.
Big rabbit trail. Or do you just stop it there? We've done our job.
Well, in which case it's like, okay, now then would the SBC again be liable for, I was falsely accused and you went along with it. My life was ruined, like the lady who, the article got reworded, her life was ruined because of what they did. Well, if I'm falsely accused, but yet, they find credible, well, now my life is ruined. You did it to me. So I get down to go sue them. It just, I don't think Southern Baptist Convention needs to be inserted into that. And so, lastly, the church is not a civil magistrate. As I said, there's the different areas of jurisdiction. One of the things on page 232 of the report is talking about the Credentials Committee, and one of the disappointments that survivors and advocates expressed about the Credentials Committee after it got formed is it said that survivors and advocates could not be satisfied because they desired justice and for the abuser to be held responsible. Well, it can't do that. The Southern Baptist Convention is incapable of providing justice and holding the abuser accountable. Just don't have that authority, don't have that capacity to do that. But whenever we're taking reports, whenever we're, determining credibly accused and all that kind of stuff, we're sending the message that we can. Whenever the convention doesn't actually have that authority. The local, like I said, the headquarters of the convention is the local church. So that body that meets in Anaheim and the people who are in the offices in Nashville to do the day-to-day stuff, they don't have any authority over a local church to hold any kind of accountability. And so,
Sounds like a vigilante or benchmark.
yeah.
We'll take care of ourselves.
The Southern Baptist Convention is not a sexual abuse advocacy organization, and I don't think we need to turn it into one. There are already organizations, Christian organizations, that are doing that sort of thing. We need to direct people to there from the Southern Baptist Convention. So some of these recommendations require creating whole new positions or tasking an existing entity, and that refocuses what the Southern Baptist is meant to be doing onto sexual abuse. That's not what the Southern Baptist Convention exists for. It exists for spreading the gospel, not to be dismissive of sexual abuse victims, survivors, but the Southern Baptist Convention isn't the right entity to give them the relief they need and the support they need. We need to make sure those entities are out there, know who they are, where they are, have relation with them, that we can direct people to them. But I don't think the SBC needs to be reinventing the wheel to become another one. Do we need to figure out some kind of internal accountability? Absolutely, right? All the separate entities, whether seminary, executive committee, international mission board, whatever it is, internally, any organization needs to, have its internal issues, because it's just like any business organization does, that employees have certain policies they have to go by. But as a convention, that's not really what it's there to do. So I think it's best that if we focus local, because that's where the abuse happens, that's where the relief is found, that's where the support is found. Some national faceless organization cannot help people. Yes, we need to have education and awareness, right? We need to make sure we have good policies and protections. We make sure we're exercising church discipline according to Matthew 18. Abusers don't start with abuse. Long before abuse gets there, there's been grooming or there's been violation of boundaries. If we're, as a community, holding one another accountable to say, no, that was inappropriate, you don't get to do that. And not just, hey, no, don't do that, but that we know, hey, you crossed a line, that there's actually some accountability for the small infractions, even just social accountability. It's like, Jake, we know what you did. You shouldn't have done that. We love you, brother. Quit it. Even if it's just small stuff. Because the small stuff turns into the big stuff. And it's whenever the big stuff comes along, and everybody goes, oh, what happened? Well, nobody was doing anything about the little stuff. That's where that comes in. And then, of course, abuse needs to be reported to the proper authorities. As I said before, it blows my mind that people go, well, the abuse happened in a church, so I'm going to go report it to a committee on a national organization, address it local and to the right people who actually have the authority and the power to do anything about it. Okay, we are crazy over time. I'm so sorry. Whenever I figured how long this was going to go, I did figure about 45 minutes. I'm so sorry. Last thoughts? Anything on any of this?
I have two questions. One, so when y'all go next week, can y'all be making suggestions to this?
Yes.
Or y'all just voting on whatever they're presenting, yes or no?
It's a giant business meeting, but because it's a business meeting with 10,000 people present, there's certain ways things structure and flow. And so, yes, we can comment, we can make recommendations. We would have to kind of make sure we're in the queue and at the microphone to step up and say our piece, because whenever discussion on an issue comes, it starts moving fast. And so, yeah.
They're gonna have an agenda that they have to follow.
Exactly.
Right.
So if they just let Mike, that you have to have a list of people, like, hey, this is what I want to
Just like
say.
any council meeting, you have to be pre-approved and know what your topic is about, and you only give it 2-3 minutes, probably tops.
Right,
Say
yeah.
anything.
500 people saying the exact same thing, you're like, okay, I'm gonna say no to 499, and just let one guy say, everybody
The
else.
thing
is
is, surely we can't be the only church who's thought, well, no, that needs to go to the local, the advocates, whatever, you know what I'm saying?
Right.
Like you call the doctor's office, they say, this is emergency, call 911. The same thing is you call us,
Yeah.
this is who you should be calling in your area, the local cops, give them numbers.
Exactly.
The second question is, so, and not that I expect it to ever happen, but should something happen in our church, where would we report it? Like say something happened to me, or saw it happen to a kid or something, where do I report that, other than the police? Because I'm in the church.
Sure.
No, I'm just saying, but I'm not saying I wouldn't report it to the police, but who would I tell in the church? That's my question.
Other than the police,
Yeah, other than the police. What's our chain of?
I'll just walk up to the pulpit Sunday morning.
Let me tell everybody here, right?
And that's my question, that's what I'm saying.
No swear.
Unless or Sam or one of the but I'm just saying, chain of command is my question.
Yeah, deacons or me,
I wouldn't be going to the SBC, but like local.
which I hope would be the second call. Hey, just to let you know, Pastor, I called the police on so-and-so because this happened. Okay. So, but
I'm thinking me, if it was, I saw it was a kid, first thing I would do is go to the parents, and then from there, so. I'd stop whatever it is, then I'd go to this, you know, because sometimes parents will.
What you got there with that, it's the guy that come up there and shoots up.
and you know that's something for another time that I need to look at, is to actually have policies and procedure in place that's specific in writing. Hey, here's how this gets handled at Liberty Hill Baptist Church.
We should just wait on the SBC to tell us what to do.
We'll just wait on, yeah.
We're just gonna wait
So,
on them.
okay. Last call. Going once, going twice.